PVC pipes on their feet, stuck in hammocks by their antlers and other obstacles. These deer typically need to be tranquilized for our safety as well as the safety of the deer, which eats up our staff time. Usually we need 2 people there at a minimum and a half day's time.
You can add to the list of whirly gigs. We have a few whirly gigs in our yard. And this deer with his horns hooked one and went running down the street. Sorry for the poor thing.
Yeah, it's pretty serious. Usually the deer that are stuck in by their antlers pull the antler off, which exposes their brain and they die from an infection. Most deer that are stuck in fences also need to be euthanized. We estimate last year that approximately 100 deer were put down by us and local law enforcement, mostly from vehicle collisions. Disease outbreaks are also becoming more common. The last 2 years, we suspect we've had an outbreak of adenovirus in town. We have submitted samples from these deer to our lab in Sacramento for testing.
What's adenovirus?
It's basically internal hemorrhaging, a lot of blood in the organs. It also kind of resembles sort of like a cold. There's a lot of diarrhea and mucus and drooling. As you all know,
Tom had a good question. When you talked about those symptoms, are you talking about the deer or are you talking about the human?
well, as I said, it's very similar to the common cold. It might be hard to distinguish.
You've been sick.
However, there is no evidence that it's transmissible to people. As you all know, the reason we are here, the deer population in town is increasing. The deer population is increasing due to high adult and fawn survival because of low predation and abundant forage in town. Excuse me. We feel that people management is really key. The abundant forage is due to intentional and unintentional deer feeding that's occurring in Susanville. Often
Can you differentiate those two and tell us examples? Because that's usually the first thing I hear is, well, people are feeding the deer, but when I talk to most people, they aren't feeding the deer and they're saying they're just coming in and eating whatever is in the yard. So is that intentional deer feeding when you have stuff in your yard?
Intentional deer feeding is when you are putting out food with the intention of the deer eating it. So like putting alfalfa out or something like that. Unintentional would be if you have a garden and it's not your intention for the deer to eat it, but the deer are hungry and they're going to eat most gardens. So that's generally unintentional. And it's fairly common for intentional deer feeders not to admit it to us, and at least not right away. You have to find the evidence. First, the straw or the alfalfa remains from the piles that they had on their yard. Excuse me. I seem to have lost my place here. Often deer feeders acknowledge the practice is illegal. In California, there is a specific regulation in our code that prohibits the feeding of deer, the intentional feeding of deer. And they are often not deterred by warnings. The department recommends using deer-proof fencing and motion-activated lights in your yard to prevent deer from feeding in your yard if they are a problem in your gardens, and also removing attractants. A common attractant around here is fruit on the ground, but also bird feeders and pet food. Pet food outside can attract deer into your yard as well.
And raccoons and everything.
And skunks is probably the number one for us. Sorry, again I lost my place. We really recommend increasing public awareness of the state prohibition against deer feeding. Many people, when we initially contact them, are not aware that intentionally feeding deer is against the law. Population control. These are pretty much the 5 methods that have been tried in California and really in most states, in most states of the United States. Divided into 2 categories, lethal and non-lethal. Lethal sport hunting is by far the most popular. And then depredation permits, which is when we issue a permit to someone that's experiencing damage from wildlife to take the wildlife. And then it can be all kinds of wildlife. Non-lethal is relocation, sterilization, and contraceptives. The challenges with managing urban deer, it is difficult because of safety concerns, and the unnatural environment makes it difficult to keep deer populations under control. Stakeholder opinions are diverse. Many people don't think it is ethical to lethally control deer. Some people don't think deer should be managed at all. Some people want more, and some people always want less. It's the department's job to explain available management options without endorsing one so that we maintain our objectivity and credibility. Cultural carrying capacity is becoming more and more popular with urban deer management. Basically, it is the number of deer that is acceptable to the most people in the community. Needs to be determined to satisfy the highest percentage of stakeholders. Normally, deer populations are regulated by habitat, predation, and other natural mechanisms. However, urban settings can support deer populations at a much higher rate, generally higher than most people would find satisfactory. Relocation has been tried twice in California. The first example is Angel Island. In 1955, it became a state park, and hunting was eliminated. And without predators on the island, the population began to fluctuate wildly. In 1980, the population was again peaking, and after intense public opposition to lethal control of the deer, the department decided to relocate 213 deer, of which 203 survived to be released in Mendocino County. After 1 year, it was estimated only 15% had survived, mostly attributed to vehicle collisions. In the following year, 1981, the remaining deer on the island were again expanding, and the SPCA proposed to chemically sterilize the does. However, they soon abandoned the project because they were unable to capture enough does to prevent the population from expanding, and in 1985 it had quadrupled. The second example is Ardenwood Park, which was fenced off, trapping approximately 12 deer. As the deer herd increased, it impacted the landscape and ag crops of the park, and in 1991 the park board of directors voted to remove the deer. Because of the poor experience in Angel Island, the department again recommended lethal control. However, there was strong public opposition, and the department reluctantly agreed to relocate all the deer. All these deer were radio collared so that we could track the movements so we wouldn't have to estimate their survival. And after 1 year, only 23 of the 27 deer were alive. Mostly, they were killed by either predators or from vehicle collision, although interesting, one was killed by a train. Just seems like kind of a rare thing, I don't know, probably happens all the time. Because of these two examples, the department is very reluctant to relocate deer, or really any wildlife. Sterilization. There's currently a department-approved project in San Jose on a retirement community with a large deer herd that is semi-fenced in. The community had complained to the department that the deer were impacting their landscape and causing them quite a bit of financial damage. So with our approval, they hired a contractor who has sterilized approximately 100 does with tubal ligation. These deer are still alive to cause damage, but at least the population doesn't grow until they die and are replaced by immigrants. Contraception requires repeated immobilization of deer because of the temporary effect of the drugs. Drugs are generally experimental and not well studied, and deer in town are often difficult to capture, especially repeatedly. Sport hunting, by far the most common method for lethal removal. Susanville is divided into two deer zones, X6A and X4. However, hunting is prohibited within 150 yards of a residence by state regulation, unless you have permission from the homeowner, which could be quite difficult in Susanville. in hunting in the street. Hunting will not likely decrease the population, but may prevent the population from increasing. Most cities have a prohibition against discharging a firearm or lethal weapon in the city limits. Proposed urban hunts have been quite controversial in other states, are often blocked by litigation or postponed. Methods used in other states are most commonly archery, although sometimes shotguns have been authorized. Locally, there have been lots of trespass issues during the archery hunt, especially along Wingfield, Richmond Road, and the Gold Run area. We've also had quite a bit of problems with taking poor shots with bows and wounding deer. Depredation permits. The department proposed depredation permits to lower populations at the two examples of Angel Island and Ardenwood, but both times abandoned the idea due to intense public opposition. And those are really the only options that we have to manage deer in an urban setting. So if you have any questions or concerns?
Yeah, thank you, we appreciate the presentation, and first we'll go to the board. Any board members comment on the presentation? Aaron?
I have a question. I'm not an archery hunter, so I don't know, but what are the rules of archery hunting with deer? I mean, is it 150 yards?
It is 150 yards for any deadly weapon in the state of California.
Any deadly weapon?
Yes, sir.
The only comment, I appreciate Brian being here, and, I mean, because I think it's a discussion the community's been interested in for quite some time, and will probably continue to be interested in. I'm sure that for every person who objects to the deer population growing out of control, there are people who want to, see them protected and so forth. And maybe one of the, if nothing else, given the numbers and how they grow based on what you've shared in these other areas, the population we have now is going to multiply many-fold over the next few years. And maybe we ought to kind of get in the habit like the Census Bureau does, where every 10 years they count how many people we have. We put on the population sign, Susanville, home to 17,500 friendly souls, and then we can put underneath it, do a herd census where we, and 27,500 deer, and then eventually be 50,000 deer, and pretty soon the deer population will be megafold, and then they'll be wanting to hunt us. So, but anyway, I just throw that out. I mean, it's
additional dose.
Additional dose. I mean, obviously that's cynical, but I think that's an issue that I guess it's a fact of life of urban living in California nowadays. And I think the big concern that expressed to me from time to time from folks is with the deer population, finding themselves very comfortable in our community environment, that their natural predator is the mountain lion, and so it brings the mountain lions into town. And given the fact that we have Prop 17 that says you can't hunt mountain lion in California, it just continues to grow that threat. And at some point, I think common sense is going to have to prevail, because having things managed or not managed is not going to work. And I mean, it's more than just deer. There are people, I'm sure, that do want to feed the deer, but there's a vast majority of folks who object to having their ornamental, whether it's a garden or flowers or whatever, trees. I mean, you try to plant a tree and you go out there and find out the tree's been devoured by, been ruined by the deer. I mean, they rub their horns on it, they scratch their back on it. I mean, they do damage that way. So it's kind of hard to maintain the landscaping. The city has landscape requirements for new businesses coming into town, and you put in literally hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of improvements and have it be destroyed overnight. So, I think that's, I guess, the reality. But given the options you said in these other areas, I just, maybe open season in terms of getting cars going around to hit deer, because I tell you, they're there, and it's unsafe to drive at times in town.
I sympathize. I've hit 2 deer since I've lived here, so I very much sympathize with you. It's hard for us to tell because our contacts with the public are a bit more biased.
Did you hit him with the state car?
No. No, both of my personal car, unfortunately. Most of the people that we contact are people that like the deer, that feed the deer. We're responding to deer that are being fed and get hit by, you know, their neighbor's car or get stuck in their fence or something like that. So it's much more biased from our experience that the people like the deer, they want more deer. I don't know, I don't really get that many complaints about the gardens, although I know that every time I'm anywhere, someone knows me, there's someone going to complain about deer in their gardens.
They may not complain to you, but they certainly like complaining to their supervisors. And
Okay.
councilmen. I'm sure Mr. Hancock can tell you that complaints City Hall gets probably on a regular basis.
Yeah. And the mountain lion sightings in Susanville are much rare. We have a lot less problems in Susanville, probably because it's a lot more developed. Where we have the biggest issue is Janesville, where there's still trees, you know, it's still kind of in the forest. There's still a lot of livestock to bring them in. But we do get, you know, there are areas of town where we get sightings all the time. Up by Susanville Ranch is probably the #1
Just
spot.
2 blocks, 3 blocks over here is, used to be called Vallejo Meadows. It's got houses in it, but it comes down the Paiute Creek drainage to Willow Street. And here wasn't too long ago, George Sargent, the owner of the Grand Cafe, his 2 daughters they lived there at the corner of Willow and Parkdale. That's where they grew up at, but they were coming back from some friends and they were at that intersection and encountered a mountain lion that far into the heart of town. He came down through the, you know, the Paiute Creek drainage, so there is, you know, an opportunity for him. It's not, it's like he was walking down the street, but he
Right.
reached a point where he had to traverse the street. So they do come into the heart of town. I think there was another one over off of by the Susan River there behind the high school, kind of down towards Alexander Street and the bridge. It had come in probably following the river course, and the vegetation, you know, maybe provided for some cover to get into. And they had to, I guess it was at Cornell and Alexander, the house on the corner there, and I see that Carol's in the audience, but I know they had to trap this and get him down out of the tree or
Well,
something.
that was a bear.
Was that, no, there was a, was it?
Yeah, that was
a
the
bear?
bear. I responded to that one. It was on a holiday, of course, in the middle of the night, and there was about 100 people probably there spooking that bear up into the tree.
But there's been mountain lion sightings down in that same neighborhood where the bear was at. I was confusing the two maybe, but I know that people get, you know, I get calls from, as part of my district, I get calls from people from time to time that are concerned about that. So.
Yeah. Yeah, most of the mountain lion troubles are definitely on, you know, they do come into town because there's so many deer in town, but they're mostly on the periphery like you were talking about, the junior college or
The
French Park or kind of the Gold Run area, Richmond
Biz
Road.
Johnson Trail.
Certainly on the Biz Johnson Trail. I've gotten a number of calls about the Biz Johnson Trail.
One of my favorite stories was back when, and this has been a few years ago, but it was Marcus Murphy was the police chief and Ron Gerald was the sheriff, and they were on the Biz kind of going up there, going here, kitty, kitty, looking for a mountain lion that had been spotted, so.
I
think that was too
yeah,
smart.
We better move along in the interest of time. I appreciate the presentation, but before we move off this item, I'll just quickly say, yeah, thanks. It appears, you know, obviously there's really nothing we can do about the problem other than
Yeah,
that's a matter of your.
yeah, pretty much
property.
that's why they're here, is there's
Yeah,
food here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you give defecation permits to people in town?
Not for deer, not generally, no.
Yeah, if you,
It's,
sights are off, it'd be play hell in the neighbor's living room window.
it would be a little unsafe, yeah.
But do any other members of the public that would like to comment on this before we move on?
Yeah, I just want to thank them for the presentation, and I think that would be something that would be beneficial if you'd like to share with the city council at some point as well. And being, a lot of the discussion is related to the city and the deer in town. And I just want to clarify a couple of points that our code enforcement department, if they get a complaint about people feeding deer, they will follow up with them. We're dealing with 3 individuals at the moment who are feeding deer and trying to reduce that. Because our fence ordinance doesn't allow fences over 6 feet, most deer can just skip right over them. And so it is a problem that we are looking at possible solutions for. Also, if there is a deer injured within the city limits, you can contact Fish and Wildlife or the police department. They, in concert, have the ability to dispatch a deer, and then they will coordinate with our Public Works Department to have that carcass removed. And so we, if you have a dead carcass, you can contact the city and we will have it removed as well. And so I think, you know, one of the questions, I know that with capturing bear that have become too friendly with humans, they sometimes they're working on a hard release program where when they release them that they, rather than shooting them with bullets, they'll use beanbags or other things to reestablish that fear of humans and to keep them out of the human environment. That might be something, I'm not sure if they've done any research on deer, and if that is effective to reestablish that fear of humans and to keep them more in a natural environment. Because we are, you know, commonly referred to as the town deer that we've established here, and it is a safety concern. And so we would be happy to partner with the Board of Supervisors and Fish and Wildlife to do what we can to increase the safety and to have a healthy deer population.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate it. Marty?
Maureen Anderson, Building and Planning and Building. My comment is, I'm concerned about underreporting of accidents. My family has experienced 2 total losses of vehicles over the past 4 years. In both cases, the accident report wasn't done by the CHP, and I know they do a great job and they're out there doing a lot, but I guess it is not the practice to do an accident report unless the insurance company request one. And so, as we move forward in the future in past practice, past projects, there's sometimes elements in projects where they want to know about accidents related to deer. And a lot of big decisions are made with that kind of data that doesn't appear to be being tracked right now. So I just think that's kind of concerning. You know, Bass Hill, I mean, anybody who drives over that hill knows it's constant. And that happened to be where one of the accidents that I experienced was. And I was just kind of surprised that that's not reported, because as you know, projects come along, like we were going to do the Honey Lake Expressway, those were key factors that led into mitigation and what kind of walls would be built, if any, and what kind of protection. So I'm just, as a comment, maybe in the future we can have CHP and or Caltrans respond to how they get that information and what the current practice is.
Good. Thank you, Marty.
Don Armentrout, Chairman Fish and Game Commission. I'll answer your question for you. We have a former highway patrolman on our commission, and he did a little study on it. The reason half of them aren't reported is because the current deduction fees, or the deduction that people take on their cars to keep their insurance costs down, they pay for the if they do $700 worth of damage to a car, they pay for it and don't report it to their insurance company or anybody. It's because their insurance rates will go up. So he said that that they did report any accident they came across, especially with deer collisions. But in most cases, people that arranged to have their car towed or whatever and were taking care of it themselves, and therefore no report was written because you couldn't find the car owner or anything. So just a dead deer.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, again, yeah, thank you, Brian, for that. Thank you, Jim, for bringing that up as an item. It was a good discussion, and thank you, Jared. And we look forward to working together, maybe seeing what could be done, if anything. But thanks. Okay.
If there's a way to, that video or that slide presentation to be able, share it with the city council is one thing, but like through our website or something, like a link that could take you to it. As far as public education, I think it's a good narrative and it has a lot of good facts. I don't know how we could, capture that, but I think it would be worth having that, so when people make calls and complain, you can refer them to that, so they can, maybe have the same appreciation we do from the challenge. What you described about these other places was, if it didn't work down there on Angel Island, it's like,
Who would you like to follow that up?
I don't know what we can do, I mean, if it's,
I can work with Brian, perhaps as we could make a link
Yeah,
to
they-
their website.
right, exactly, they'd have to be hosted or put on some website they could be linked to.
All righty. And, so Richard, can you just give us a heads up on that, and then we can all have a look? And let forward the link to people in our emails. Okay, thank you. Let's move to H1, the Honey Lake Valley Recreation Authority.
All right. Mr. Chairman, as you all know, Honey Lake Valley Recreation Authority is moving very quickly, and I see Mr. Hancock in the audience as their interim executive director. They have asked the county a couple of questions, one dealing with the sites of the pool, and I've attached 2 letters from Mr. Hancock regarding the 2 different sites that they may be interested in. And the gist of the letter simply is to ask the board's level of interest in providing one or both of those sites as potential sites for the pool. The second issue revolves around the Treasury Management Services for the Joint Powers Authority. And as I've discussed with some of the board members that are on the Joint Powers Authority board, there's two basic ways that the JPA can have their funds held. 3 ways. One being with one of the Joint Powers Authorities members, which would be either the city or the county. So the city treasury or the county treasury could act as the financial warehouse, for lack of a better word, for their funding. The third option is for them to appoint their own treasurer, who would then be obligated to all the various rules that apply to treasuries. It seems because of the size of the Joint Powers Authority and the amount of dollars that they're going to be handling, that it's more efficient for one or the other to one of the other agencies to handle that. Some of the board members have expressed concerns about the costs associated with the county managing the funds because of the cost allocation plan that results in all the indirect costs going back to whoever incurs those. With regard to just the treasury portion of the function, all those fees are taken out of earnings, so there isn't a net cost. With regard to auditor's services, there are costs that are experienced that are typically spread over agencies. So the request is of the board to either temporarily or permanently waive those costs that would normally be borne by the agency on the auditor's side, and have, which would allow them to have their funds maintained by the county. So those are the 2 issues in front of you today.
If I could address that issue, Mr. Chairman, because I'm the board member on the JPA board that has expressed the concern about the costs that the county assesses. And I think there's 2 parts of the cost. Cost is, it costs physically X number of dollars to write a check. And the auditor's office is a very expensive check writing effort for all the departments involved. We're not talking about a lot of checks being written by this agency because we aren't up and running yet. But once you get to a point where you have the pool functioning, you're going to be having payroll and vendors and everything else. But for the first first year or so, in terms of, that's not going to be the case. It'll be relatively small numbers of checks being written. And the JPA board isn't, adverse to paying whatever that direct cost is. But it's all the indirect costs that get rolled into when you deal with the auditor's office. And we're concerned about having a few dollars we have to work with being consumed by AD7 costs coming back, in out years, retroactively being applied. And so I'm not interested in seeing this entity because it's basically a local effort. We're not at this point using federal and state dollars. We're using our dollars, and to have the federal model of cost allocations being applied to it, so it becomes a percentage of this and a percentage of that, whatever it may be. And we're gonna have our own attorney, we have our own office operation, you know, so we're not really depending upon those support services that the cost allocation plan would be tracking and covering. But nonetheless, we would be subject to some of those charges being assessed back. And what Mr. Egan indicated to the JPA board was that we could have no problem, we've done it with other entities from time to time.